Cool. So what you see here is Shanghai, where I spent the last 8 weeks in lockdown. And what you see is that right now there's literally nothing happening here. So yeah, what was for me a time where I had a lot of time to think and a lot of time to reflect, and also a lot less external stimulation, um, which made me think about a lot of things that I usually do when I'm not in this 8-week meditation camp. So I researched a lot about the brain and how brain reacts in different situations. And what I thought a lot about is essentially our life in 2022, like our life in current circumstances and things that we're exposed to. And I thought a lot about, especially social media and a lot of like easy to do things, and how they are somehow in competition with the harder things that we actually want to do, like working on our businesses, studying a new skill, all these kind of things. They're in permanent competition. And in a normal life nowadays, you just have so much stimulation that often the easy things can win, right? They can just by default, they win because they're architected in a way to make you addicted, based on dopamine and so on, which we will discuss in detail later. So yeah, I thought about, okay, how could I basically reverse that? Like, how could I make the hard things easy without much willpower? Because I thought about like situations when I'm in these kind of states and in like basically whatever, when I'm going out, when I scroll through social media, all these kind of things, eat something like some fast food kind of stuff. Usually it's like pretty effortless, right? You don't really think about, like, if you're on a date, you don't really think about time much, like things are just flowing somewhat. You're not running out of energy, you're not running out of focus, you're just functioning. And you're functioning usually at a pretty high level, without much willpower. So I thought about, okay, how can I understand what's happening in the brain there? And then how can I apply that to the things that I actually want to achieve on the long term? And all this research that I did and the results of it, I'm going to share today. So the topic is how to make work or any other productive activity that you're working on more addictive than social media. So that's the topic that we want to explore today. Disclaimer, obviously this is not medical advice. Do your own research. All the sources are scientific, and I read most of the studies that were referenced in some podcasts and stuff, but there's a lot to it. And what I did here is I really simplified it so that it's somewhat pragmatically applicable. Why does this matter? Like, let's have a first look at this. I think it's important to really, drill that down. Why does focus matter so much? I think it matters overall from two perspectives. It's basically a formula. Because on the one hand side, you have focus as a noun. Like there's this famous story of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett when they were asked, what is the one thing that's most relevant to your success, to the success you've had? And that was actually Bill Gates' father, I think, that asked it to. And both said almost at the same time, focus, right? And the discussion then evolved a lot about like focusing on basically one thing for the whole life. Like for Warren Buffett, it was money and investing. For Bill Gates, it was computers and programming, right? So essentially that is the one definition of focus. But we also have another definition of focus, which is the verb to focus, which is more complete attention in a given moment, like not being distracted by anything. And essentially, if we combine the two, it will by default result in creating value and success or in whatever stuff you want, right? Because if you do something with full attention over a long period, you're probably going to become pretty good at it. And obviously to do that, you need to be properly motivated. You can't quit early. You cannot be distracted. Like overall, the motivation behind it is pretty important. So how does that stuff work? To simplify it, essentially there are two relevant parts here in the brain. The first is the cerebral cortex or the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for cognition and all rational thinking. And then we have two parts, which are the hypothalamus and the amygdala, which are more responsible for like emotions and impulses. Like the hypothalamus is more for like regulating body temperature, these kind of things. So all the stuff that comes from here is more emotional, more intuitive, and so on. And our brain, our prefrontal cortex is more rational. So those two play together, obviously. And if we start with the prefrontal cortex, it's what makes us human. Like it's if you look into the brain of different animals, including us, you see that our prefrontal cortex is obviously larger because we're better at controlling our impulses. That's why we're not like all the other animals, basically. And Huberman, who's like an expert in this field of study, he describes the prefrontal cortex as a brake on emotions or impulses, brake on dopamine, all these other neurotransmitters. So yeah, essentially how it works is we have an impulse and then our prefrontal cortex regulates that and decides like, what are we actually going to do with it? And yeah, that's the role of the prefrontal cortex. As these two parts play together, like the more emotional parts of the brain and the more rational parts of the brain, yeah, they exhaust the prefrontal cortex at a certain limitation, right? Like we don't have infinite willpower. We cannot convince ourselves the whole day to not do something. At a certain point, it gets harder. It's usually, we recognize it in the evening. If it did a lot of hard work, it's usually harder in the evening to stick to stuff, to push through these kind of things. So that is essentially because willpower is depleted in a very simplified way. And yeah, so what I asked myself is like, why use a finite resource? Like, I overall think I have pretty good impulse control. I'm overall, like, just my personality type is pretty rational. But overall, it doesn't really make sense because I knew that in these other situations, like whatever, when I go out, all these kind of things, it's like a more natural kind of thing. I don't really have to exert willpower. So I thought, okay, it's good to understand this, but let's move on. Let's understand the other part, the more emotional part of it. And here, all of you heard about dopamine. Yeah, we know that dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's responsible for motivation. And one famous experiment that was conducted that's pretty interesting is with a rat. So they essentially destroyed the receptors in the brain of this rat that are responsible for dopamine. And they distanced the rat a little bit from food or from other stimulations that would give it pleasure. And the rat just didn't move there. However, when they fed the rat, like when they literally put the food in the mouth of the rat still ate it, and the rat still had some form of pleasure, which was basically the evidence for dopamine being the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation. And yeah, that's the same for us. If there's a lot of dopamine, we are very motivated. If there's very little dopamine, we're not motivated. So in a very simplified way. Another very important thing to understand about dopamine is that dopamine really doesn't care how it is stimulated, and it always wants more. Like those are two pretty important facts. There was another experiment, which you see here, where they essentially connected the brain of a rat to some sort of drugs. So they injected drugs so that the rat would release dopamine when it pulled the trigger. And the rat just didn't stop. The rat just like pulled and pulled and pulled until it was basically completely exhausted. But the rat forgot about eating, sleeping, drinking, everything, right? So what that really shows is like, it doesn't matter really for the rat what it does. Like the more productive behavior would obviously be for the rat to find some food, to find some mates, all of these things. But yeah, the disillusion with the drugs in this case in the brain just make the rat keep pulling the trigger. And I thought that's like kind of a funny analogy for like us humans right now with smartphones and this stuff, right? But like we often know that like scrolling 2 hours a day, maybe even longer, on our phone on all these social media apps, they release some dopamine, but they don't really help us in many aspects. So yeah, I thought that's pretty interesting, that experiment. And two key takeaways are: dopamine doesn't care how it's stimulated, and once you have the first shot of dopamine, it always motivates you to do the same thing again and again. So how does this actually work in the real life with us humans? So overall, different things have a different impact on our dopamine. A coffee pushes our dopamine level roughly 30%, food roughly 50% above baseline, sex about 100, nicotine actually more than sex, which I found pretty fascinating. It's 150%, that's why it's so addictive. Gaming, social media, like I put it like at 175, like a little bit over nicotine. That's where it's estimated that the studies on that are not 100% clear, but it's roughly estimated to be there. And then you have stuff like cocaine, which is like just infinite, basically. It just pumps it through the roof. And this is how stuff we eat, that we consume, that we watch, all of that is actually pushing our dopamine on a daily basis, just by external factors. So the clear conclusion is just take some Coke in the morning and everything's fine. Obviously not. Need to understand it a little bit more. And what we want to understand is how dopamine actually works, and many things actually become pretty clear. Like this thing is, like it opened my eyes to a lot of things. So essentially what you see is that you have a baseline, and let's say you wake up and you don't think anything, you're not motivated to anything, you're just in your bed, right? So there's no motivation. And then something comes to your head. Let's say you didn't eat much the day before, and you're really fucking hungry, and you think about food, then your dopamine level spikes already in the anticipation, okay? Then you might become motivated, you wake up, you go into your kitchen, and then you actually consume something to eat, something you like. And that is when you reach the high point here, okay? So that's when it's fully spiked, but actually the difference between the anticipation and the actual consumption of whatever you're consuming, it's not that high, it's just the last kick. However, what happens after that is your dopamine decreases a bit, and I just labeled it as pain. So some other neurotransmitters, they are increasing. So it's pretty diabolical, actually. Like after you had a dopamine spike, there's pain coming in. And this is, for example, when you watch social media, like, or if you open a social media app, you scroll and scroll and scroll, you see that over time, the pain becomes bigger and the dopamine becomes smaller. And this is usually the point where you think like, why the fuck am I looking at my phone? It's not even pleasurable, right? That is when the pain comes pretty close to your dopamine level, and you're not really motivated to put your phone away. This is also the reason why probably no one in human history just had one beer, right? Like, because if you drink one beer, you're here and there's pain and you want to eliminate the pain. You want to bring it up again, so you have a second beer. And that's just how the brain works. I think it's pretty fascinating to understand this, because it gives us, pretty impactful conclusions, which we will come to later, how to actually control the cycle. There's another part to understand about this in this cycle. If you have a really high spike, like let's say you achieve a major goal for yourself, then obviously it spikes a lot, like dopamine spikes a lot, but after that it crashes below baseline, which I described here as hangover, and serotonin increases, which means you become calm and relaxed, and you're usually not motivated to do much after that. That is usually the feeling that you have after achieving a big goal. You're actually not motivated anymore, and you're thinking, all right, like, so now what? This is the reason for that. So now that we learned quite a bit about dopamine, the main question that I wanted to answer for myself and also for you guys is, how can we actually control this proactively and use it for ourselves? Because obviously, like what Facebook and so on does, like they architect the experience in a way that makes us addicted, right? First thing that I was surprised about, but that makes a lot of sense, is dopamine is subjective. It's not totally objective, because you saw that the anticipation is a very important part in this whole game. It's not necessarily only the thing that you get, it's everything that happens before it. And your anticipation works also in your subjective perception. For example, if I would tell you, hey, let's do this for the next 3 hours, we can earn $1. Probably you're not motivated, because $1 is not much for you, and you think like, fuck that. If I will tell you we can make $1 million in 3 hours, you'll probably think that's it's probably a scam, right? It's probably not real. You're also not that super motivated, because you think like, all right, we will try something that probably doesn't work. Turns out that the sweet spot is in the middle. So they had studies, and basically people that obviously like set smart goals that are like specific and achievable, but still challenging, they have double the chance of goal achievement. However, the interesting thing is that this is totally subjective, right? Like for some people, earning $1 million an hour is totally possible. Like for Elon Musk, it wouldn't be a big deal. So from that perspective, you can change these things, right? You can change the moment when you will actually release the full dopamine when you achieve your goal, which is really interesting. Then also it has a relationship over time. And what I mean with that is it goes a lot into the direction of temporal discounting. And we will contrast a few things here. The first thing is what I call here the discounted donut. It's like essentially whatever, if someone tells you, hey, like let's work out for an hour and then we eat a donut, if you happen to love donuts, right? Like you might do it like for the donut, if it's a great donut or whatever. However, if that person tells you, let's work out, I'm going to give you a donut in 5 years, like that's not really relevant, right? So our experience and our reward is automatically discounted in our brain. And something in 5 years, like especially something small like a donut, doesn't really matter that much. So we discount things, which is important to understand if we set goals and if we go in that direction. And then what you see a lot in like self-development books and so on is like positive visualization. Right? It's like authors and gurus saying like, visualize yourself like in a year from now and you will look like this and you will be rich, all that kind of stuff. And turns out that from a science perspective, this has zero effect on actual goal achievement. Like it's usually not relevant enough. And it's what I try to visualize a bit with the size here. Like, okay, in 5 years, this is going to be great. But actually, if I discount it to now, I rather have the donut. Like the donut gives me more satisfaction than the probability, the lower probability that I will actually have a six-pack in a couple of years, right? So it doesn't work. Positive visualization doesn't work, at least not in the studies that were conducted. However, what works is negative visualization. And that actually increases goal achievement also by doubling the probability of goal achievement. So essentially, if you say like, okay, if I eat this donut, I'm going to be fat in a year. Could be something completely different. You could say like, if I don't work today, I'm going to be poor in a year or whatever. Or even it might even be, okay, I'm just going to stay at the same level, right? Even that might be a painful thing for you. It turns out that this is really effective, actually. And the reason why this is effective is that it triggers fear. And fear is one of the most impactful motivators for us humans, right? And this triggers adrenaline. It sends adrenaline to our prefrontal cortex and tells it, do something, like you have to do something, and it triggers action. And it triggers usually the right action. So that is something that I found really interesting. It's basically using loss aversion for yourself, selling yourself with loss aversion. Going further, like now we learned basically how we can move ourselves in the right direction. But obviously the target is to stay on track for a very, very long time, for decades, basically. And this is all about optimizing your dopamine schedule. And Andrew Huberman said it better than I could say it. And his conclusion is, don't spike dopamine prior to engaging in effort, and don't spike dopamine after engaging in effort. Learn to spike dopamine from effort itself. So he has a lot of great podcasts on this, on dopamine scheduling and so on. So yeah, our question is, how can we actually do this? And it's actually, with the stuff that we learned, it's not that tricky. It's essentially, we delay the really big spike, like with setting longer term goals and not releasing the full dopamine before that because we haven't achieved our goal, is the most optimal for performance, because you will have micro achievements here, but you know that they are just micro achievements in between, right? And you will work further, work further, work further. And then at a certain point, you got to reward yourself. I mean, that's natural. But yeah, the key is to lay that out and to set the goal a little bit further, essentially. And again, this is a subjective point in terms of goal achievement and work. This plays together with a couple of other factors which you can use to improve upon that. Like, you can obviously eliminate a lot of stuff that triggers dopamine and like distorts your dopamine perception. You can set your subjective goals differently, but there are some other pretty powerful effects. One is the reward prediction error. If we contrast two things that I've shown you, like situation one is you just get a payment from a client that you get every month, but you expected it. It's not going to spike much dopamine, or you get your paycheck or whatever. It's just normal business. So it's not going to spike dopamine much. However, in comparison, if your best friend would throw a big party with Jordan Belfort and Wolf of Wall Street style, and yeah, invite all your friends and just have like crazy party, and you didn't expect it at all, it would spike a lot of dopamine, because dopamine is spiked in relationship to the difference to what is expected. So if you expect nothing and you have a crazy spike, that releases a lot of dopamine in that moment. Whereas if you expect already a certain level and you get that level, it's not that high. Also, novelty increases it. Like everything that's new also increases the dopamine release. This is also important in business, just a side note, but it's essentially a business hack that smart businesses use. Obviously social media, but I found one example that I found quite nice, which is Tesla. They built in a couple of, they call it Easter eggs inside the Tesla, like very small things that no one really expected. For example, if you buy their autopilot software and you turn it on 4 times, so you do something specific, you're going to have like a Mario Kart, like Rainbow Road, like something very small, but something you don't expect, and something that you probably tell your friends and so on. So it's sometimes about these small things that can release way more dopamine than the actual cost. Like probably the cost of developing this is nothing in comparison to the car itself. So under promising and over delivering really works also in business. But coming back to our topic, how can we control our own dopamine? Further hack is to randomize it. Like random success and random dopamine release has a big effect on, I would call it like an addiction in a positive and in a negative way. You see that in a casino where things are built the way that you just win enough to keep playing. If you would always win, obviously you would make a lot of money, but it would get boring at a certain point. If you would always lose, like it would also get boring. So the art is to just sometimes, and in unexpected intervals, obviously, because we learned that unexpectedness is important here, that optimizes dopamine. I mean, it's the same with social media. Like it's not equally distributed. If you scroll through your social media, like sometimes you just find something, right? That's oh wow, that's cool, and then you like go further there. How we can do that, or how that works in real life, I thought about it. There are 2 ways. The one is natural, and that just comes from striving for big goals. Like you will fail, you will not always win. And from that perspective, it actually gives us quite of an appreciation for that, because it keeps us ourselves motivated to stay on the track and to push through and to find the solution to whatever we're trying to solve. The other one is you can randomize synthetically. Like also Huberman, he recommends to just sometimes, if you achieve something, don't feel good. Just like continue with the next thing. Or tell someone else to control if you're allowed to feel good. Like make it totally random. Like another person to say, oh, for this, yes. But for the other thing, not. Your girlfriend could do that, or whomever, right? Like it's a little bit of a strange idea, but if you think about how effective casinos are in inducing addiction, it's not that stupid actually. So yeah, we learned a lot of things, and I put them together in the 5 pillars of dopamine control. And it's just a summary that you can take away and apply for yourself. The first one is obvious. It's a reduction in everything that triggers dopamine to a high level artificially. Right? Like if you have a lot of stimulation outside of the thing that you actually want to work on, it's going to be very hard for you to motivate yourself. Obviously, this was very easy for me in the last 8 weeks, but I did it also consciously. Like I didn't use my phone a lot. Like I deinstalled all the social media apps, all that stuff. And I really recognized that over the weeks, I had less and less of the feeling to just grab my phone, for example. Now I don't have it anymore. I literally, maybe during lunch break, I answer the messages that I have to answer, and then in the evening, but I don't have that feeling anymore, which shows me that just reducing these things just makes them less relevant for your brain, which is great. The other things that we discussed is negative visualization, visualizing the person that you don't want to become, to use fear as a trigger. Next one is to set these challenging but somewhat realistic goals and to play a little bit around with them, because it's totally subjective, but they are very real when it comes to dopamine release. And then review your progress like every week or so, to actually sometimes consciously also release a dopamine, oh, I really achieved this, to trick your brain, or not to trick, to train your brain to connect the main dopamine release to the thing that you actually want to do. And then lastly, you can integrate randomization and novelty to enhance these effects quite a bit. So these are the four key things. And then what you can do on top of that or with this is to habitualize it, right? You can literally use your prefrontal cortex to make these things conscious, to train some of these things consciously. And whatever, for me, it's now a habit not to look at my phone much anymore. So this gives me a lot of bandwidth to think about more important things with my prefrontal cortex, right? So all of this actually plays together. And how I think about it now, like these are really the basic habits of getting anything done. So I know if I have them down, like I can focus on other things way more. Like I'm just going to be so much more effective and efficient in everything else that I do. So probably very high return on investment and very high return on time, probably more importantly, habits that, at the end of the day, will then, if we look at this brain pick again, or if we think about this brain pick again, you architect everything that happens in your amygdala and your hypothalamus and these more emotional parts of the brain. So all of that is more controlled by yourself and not by external factors. But then also you reduce the load on your prefrontal cortex, and you can actually think more rationally overall and are more motivated in the right direction. That's it. Happy to discuss implications and applications with you guys.